Hi, fifth graders. We're going to read My Side of the Mountain today, and we're actually going to be reading 3 chapters today. We will start with chapter 14, which is called We All Learn About Halloween, and we'll read chapters 15 and 16 as well. The last time we read, Sam was kind of getting ready for winter, and fall had come, and he was starting to get pretty lonely, especially because he had just met Bando, who was a college professor who had gotten lost in the forest, and hung out with Sam for a while and learned how to live off the land, and shared some of his knowledge of the forest and some of the plants and things that were in the forest. So now Bando's gone, and Sam had a big achievement of building a fireplace. So that was like a huge thing that he needed to do, and he was really psyched about it. But then he actually didn't make any ventilation in his tree for the fireplace, and was pretty frightened because he almost killed himself, and frightful because they didn't have enough oxygen. So that's where we left off. And so this is going to be the start of chapter 14, in which we all learn about Halloween. October 28th. I have been up and down the mountain every day for a week, watching to see if walnuts and hickory nuts are ripe. Today I found the squirrels all over the trees, harvesting them furiously. And so I have decided that, ripe or not, I must gather them. It's me or the squirrels. I tethered Frightful in the hickory tree while I went to the walnut tree and filled pouches. Frightful protected the hickory nuts. She keeps the squirrels so busy scolding her that they don't have time to take the nuts. They are quite terrified by her. It's a good scheme. I shout and bang the tree and keep them away while I gather. I have never seen so many squirrels. They hang from the slender branches. They bounce through the limbs. They seem to come from the whole forest. They must pass messages along to each other, messages that tell what kind of nuts are where and where the trees are. A few days later, my storehouse rolling with nuts, I began the race for apples. Entering the race were squirrels, raccoons, and a fat old skunk who looked like he could not eat another bite. He was ready to sleep his autumn meal off, and I resented him because he did not need my apples. However, I did not toy with him. I gathered what apples I could, cut some in slices, and dried them on the boulder in the sun. Some I put in the storeroom tree to eat right away. They were a little wormy, but it was wonderful to eat an apple again. Then, one night, this was all done. The crop was gathered. I sat down to make a few notes when the Baron came sprinting into sight. He actually bounced up and licked the edges of my turtle shell bowl, stormed Frightful, and came to my feet. "Baron Weasel," I said, "it's nearing Halloween. Are you playing trick-or-treats?" I handed him the remains of my turtle soup dinner and, fascinated, watched him devour it. So remember that the Baron never really took anything that Sam had to eat, even when he was offered it. So Sam's probably really surprised that this is happening. And these are his notes. The Baron chews with his back molars and chews with ferocity. With a ferocity I've not seen in him before. His eyes gleam, the lips curl back from his white pointed teeth, and he frowns like an angry man. If I move toward him, a rumble starts in his chest that keeps me back. He flashes glances at me. It is indeed strange to be looked at in the eye by this fearless wild animal. There is something human about his beady glance, perhaps because the glance tells me something. It tells me he knows who I am, and he does not want me to come any closer. The Baron Weasel departed after his feast. Frightful, who was drawn up as skinny as a stick, relaxed and fluffed her feathers, and then I said to her, "See, he got his treats, no tricks." Then something occurred to me. I reached inside the door and pulled out my calendar stick. I counted 28, 29, 30, 31. Frightful, that old weasel knows. It is Halloween. Let's have a Halloween party. Swiftly, I made piles of cracked nuts, smoked rabbit, and crayfish. I even added 2 of my apples. This food was an invitation to the squirrels, foxes, raccoons, and possums. Even the birds that lived around me could come to the party. When Frightful is tethered to her stump, some of the animals and birds will only come close enough to scream at her. So Bird and I went inside the tree, propped open the flap, and waited. Not much happened that night. I learned it takes a little time for the woodland message to get around, but they do. Before the party, I had been very careful about leaving food out because I needed every mouthful. I took the precaution of rolling a stone in front of my store tree. The harvest moon rose. Frightful and I went to sleep. At dawn, we abandoned the party. I left the treats out, however. Since it was a snappy gold-colored day, we went off to get some more rabbit skins to finish my winter underwear. We had lunch along the creek, stewed mussels and wild potatoes. We didn't get back until dusk because I discovered some wild rice in an oxbow of the stream. There was no more than a handful. Home that night, everything seemed peaceful enough. A few nuts were gone to the squirrels, I thought. I baked a fish in leaves and ate a small, precious amount of wild rice. It was marvelous. As I settled down to scrape the rabbit skins of the day, my neighbor the skunk marched right into the campground and set to work on the smoked rabbit. I made some Halloween notes. The moon is coming up behind the aspens. It is as big as a pumpkin and as orange. The winds are cool, the stars are like electric light bulbs. I am just inside the doorway with my turtle shell lamp burning so that I can see to write this. Something is moving beyond the second hemlock. Frightful is very alert, as if there are things all around us. Halloween was over at midnight last night, but for us it is just beginning. That's how I feel anyhow, but it just may be my imagination. I wish Frightful would stop pulling her feathers in and drawing herself up like a spring. I keep thinking that she feels things. Here comes Jesse C. James. He will still want the venison. He didn't get the venison. There was a snarl and a big raccoon I've never seen walked past him, growling and looking ferocious. Jesse C. stood motionless, I might say scared stiff. He held his head at an angle and let the big fellow eat. If Jesse so much rolled his eyes, that old coon would sputter at him. It grew dark and I couldn't see much. An eerie yelp beyond the boulder announced that the red fox of the meadow was nearing. He gave me goosebumps. He stayed just beyond my store tree, weaving back and forth on silent feet. Every now and then he would cry, a wavery, owl-like cry. I wrote some more. The light from my turtle lamp cast leaping shadows. To the beech nuts have come a small gray animal. I can't make out what. Now I see it. It's a flying squirrel. That surprises me. I've never seen a flying squirrel around here before. But of course, I haven't been up much after sunset. So flying squirrel, it's like different than a squirrel that he's talked about in the past. So that's another one where I think I'll put a video up in the animals folder so that you guys can see what a flying squirrel is. When it grew too dark to see, I lit a fire, hoping it would not end the party. I did not, and the more I watched, the more I realized that all these animals were familiar with my camp. The white-footed mouse walked over my woodpile as if it was his. I put out a candle and fell asleep when the fire turned to coals. Much later, I was awakened by screaming. I lifted my head and looked into the moonlit forest. A few guests, still lingering at the party, saw me move and dashed bashfully into the ground cover. One was big and slender. I thought perhaps a mink. As I slowly came awake, I realized that the screaming was coming from behind me. Something was in my house. I jumped up and shouted, and 2 raccoons skittered under my feet. I reached for my candle, slipped on hundreds of nuts, and fell. When I finally got a light and looked about me, I was dismayed to see what a mess my guests had made of my treehouse. They had found a cache of acorns and beech nuts, and I had tossed them all over my bed and floor. The party was getting rough. I chased the raccoons into the night and stumbled over a third animal and was struck by a wet, stinging spray. It was skunk! I was drenched. As I got used to the indignity and the smell, I saw the raccoons cavort around my fireplace and dodge past me. They were back in my tree before I could stop them. A bat winged in from the darkness and circled the tallow candle. It was Halloween and the goblins were at work. I thought of all the ash cans I had knocked over on the streets of New York. It seemed utterly humorless. Having invited all these neighbors, I was now faced with the problem of getting rid of them. The raccoons were feeling so much at home that they snatched up beech nuts, bits of dried fish and venison, and tossed them playfully into the air. They were too full to eat anymore, but they were having a marvelous time making toys out of my hard-won winter food supply. I herded the raccoons out of the tree and laced the door. I was breathing relief when I turned my head to the left, for I sensed someone watching me. There in the moonlight, his big ears erect on his head, sat the red fox. He was smiling. I know he was. I shouted, "Stop laughing!" and he vanished like a magician's handkerchief. All this had awakened Frightful, who was flopping in the dark in the tree. I reached in around the deer flap to stroke her back to calmness. She grabbed me so hard I yelled, and the visitors moved to the edge of my camp at my cry. Smelling to the sky, bleeding in the hand, and robbed of part of my hard-won food, I threw wood on the fire and sent an enormous shaft of light into the air. Then I shouted. The skunk moved farther away. The raccoons galloped off a few feet and galloped back. I snarled at them. They went to the edge of the darkness and stared at me. I had learned something that night from the very raccoon bossing Jesse C. James. To animals, might is right. I was the biggest, and I was the oldest, and I was going to tell them so. I growled and snarled and hissed and snorted. It worked. They understood and moved away. Some looked back, and their eyes glowed. The red eyes chilled me. Never had there been a more real Halloween night. I looked up, expecting to see a witch. The last bat of the season darted in the moonlight. I dove on my bed and tied the door. There are no more notes about Halloween. So Sam made a major mistake by inviting all those animals with all the food, because they discovered all of his stuff, like everything that he had stored up in the tree, and everything about his camp, and he really doesn't want that. So he really had to demonstrate his might, that he called it, his place, like his place in like the pecking order of things, so that they understood that he was bigger and mightier than they were. So this next chapter is called "In which I find out what to do with hunters." So the hunters must be back. That party had a moral ending. Don't feed wild animals. I picked up and counted my walnuts and hickory nuts. I was glad to discover that there was more mess than loss. I decided that I would not only live until spring, but that I had more nuts than all the squirrels on Gribley's, including flying squirrels. In early November, I was awakened one morning by a shot from a rifle. The hunting season had begun. I had forgotten all about that. To hide from a swarm of hunters was truly going to be a trick. They would be behind every tree and on every hill and dale. They would be shooting at everything that moved, and here I was in deerskin pants and a dirty brown sweater, looking like a deer. I decided, like the animals, to stay holed up for the first day of the season. I whittled a fork and finished my rabbit skin winter underwear. I cracked a lot of walnuts. The second day of hunting season, I stuck my head out of my door and decided my yard was messy. I picked it up so that it looked like a forest floor. The third day of hunting season came, and some men came in and camped by the gorge. I tried to steal down the other side of the mountain to the north stream, found another camp of hunters there, and went back to my tree. By the end of the week, both Frightful and I were in need of exercise. Gunshots were still snapping around the mountain. I decided to go see Miss Turner at the library. About an hour later, I wrote this. I got as far as the edge of the hemlock grove when a shot went off practically at my elbow. I didn't have Frightful's Jessie's in my hands, and she took off like a blast. I climbed a tree. There was a hunter so close to me that he could have bitten me, but apparently he was so busy watching his deer. I was able to get up into the high branches without being seen. First, I looked around for Frightful. I could see her nowhere. I wanted to whistle for her, but I didn't think I should. I sat still and looked and wondered if she had gone home. I watched the hunter track his deer. The deer was still running. From where I was, I could see it plainly, going toward the old Gribbly farm site. Quietly, I climbed higher and watched. Then, of all things, it jumped the stone fence and fell dead. I thought I would stay in the tree until the hunter quartered his kill and dragged it out on the road. Then it occurred to me that he wasn't even going to find that deer. He was going off at an angle, and from what I could see, the deer had dropped in the big bank of dry ferns and would be hard to find. It got to be nerve-wracking at this point. I could see my new jacket lying in the ferns and the hunter looking for it. I closed my eyes and mentally steered him to the left. Then, good old Frightful, she had winged down the mountain and was sitting in a sapling maple not far from the deer. She saw the man and screamed. He looked in her direction. Heaven knows what he thought she was, but he turned and started toward her. She rustled her wings, climbed into the sky, and disappeared over my head. I did want to whistle to her, but I feared for my deer, for myself, and her. I hung in the tree and waited about half an hour. Finally, the man gave up his hunt. His friends called and he went down the mountain. I went down the tree. In the dry ferns lay a nice young buck. A buck is a male deer. I covered it carefully with some of the stones from the fence and more ferns and rushed home. I whistled, and down from the top of my own hemlock came Frightful. I got a piece of birch bark to write all of this on so I wouldn't get too anxious and go for the deer too soon. We will wait until dark to go get our dinner in my new jacket. I am beginning to think I'll have all the deer hide and venison I could use. There must be other lost game on this mountain. I got the deer after dark, and I was quite right. Before the season was over, I got 2 more deer in the same way. However, with the first deer to work on, and the rest of the season passed quickly. I had lots of scraping and preparing to do. My complaint was that I did not dare light a fire and cook that wonderful meat. I was afraid of being spotted. I ate smoked venison, nut meats, and hawthorn berries. Hawthorn berries taste a little bit like apples. They are smaller and drier than apples. They also have big seeds in them. The hawthorn bush is easy to tell because it has big, red, shiny thorns on it. Each day the shooting lessened, and the hunters left the hills and went home. As they cleared out, Frightful and I were freer and freer to roam. The air temperature now was cold enough to preserve the venison, so I didn't smoke the last 2 deer. And about 2 weeks after, I heard the first alarming shot. I cut off a beautiful steak, built a bright fire, and when the embers were glowing, I had myself a real dinner. I soaked some dried puffballs in water, and when they were big and moist, I fried them with wild onions and skimpy old wild carrots and stuffed myself until I felt kindly toward all men. I wrote this. November 26th. Hunters are excellent friends if used correctly. Don't let them see you, but follow them closely. Preferably use the tops of trees for this purpose, for hunters don't look up. They look down and to the right and left and straight ahead. So if you stay in the trees, you can not only see what they shoot, but also where it falls. And if you are extremely careful, you can sometimes get it to it before they do and hide it. That's how I got my 3rd deer. I had a little more trouble tanning these hides because the water in my oak stump kept freezing at night. It was getting cold. I began wearing my rabbit fur underwear most of the morning. It was still too warm at noon to keep it on, but it felt good at night. I slept in it until I got my blanket made. I did not scrape the deer hair off my blanket. I liked it on. Because I had grown, one deerskin wouldn't cover me. I sewed part of another one to it. The 3rd hide I made into a jacket. I just cut a rectangle with a hole for my head and sewed on straight wide sleeves. I put enormous pockets all over it, using every scrap I had, including the pouches I had made last summer. It looked like a cross between a Russian military blouse and a carpenter's apron, but it was warm, roomy, and I thought, handsome. So here's a picture of Sam in his deerskin suit. So you can kind of see his big pockets that he sewed, and Frightful's on his shoulder. Okay, and then this is the last chapter we're going to read today. It's called In Which Trouble Begins. So I wonder what's going to happen. I stood in my doorway the 23rd of November, dressed from head to toe in deerskins. I was lined with rabbit fur. I had mittens and squirrel-lined moccasins. I was quite excited by my wardrobe. I whistled and Frightful came to my fist. She eyed me with her silky black eyes and pecked at my suit. Frightful, I said, this is not food. It's my new suit. Please don't eat it. She peeped softly, fluffed her feathers, and looked gently toward the meadow. You are beautiful too, Frightful, I said, and I touched the slate gray feathers of her back. Very gently, I stroked the jet black ones that came down from her eyes. Those beautiful marks gave her much of her superb dignity. In a sense, she had also come into a new suit. Her plumage, that's her feathers, had changed during autumn, and she was breathtaking. I walked to the spring and we looked in. I saw us quite clearly, as there were no longer any frogs to plop in the water and break the mirror with circles and ripples. Frightful, I said, as I turned and twisted and looked. We would be quite handsome if it were not for my hair. I need another haircut. I did the best job I was able to with a penknife. It's like a little knife. I made a mental note to make a hat to cover the stray ends. Then I did something which took me by surprise. I smelled the clean air of November, turned once more to see how the back of my suit looked, and walked down the mountain. I stepped over the stream on the stones. I walked to the road. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was on my way to town. As I walked down the road, I kept pretending I was going to the library, but it was Sunday and I knew the library was closed. I tethered Frightful just outside town on a stump. I didn't want to attract any attention. Kicking stones as I went and whistling, I walked to the main intersection of town as if I came every Sunday. I saw the drugstore and began to walk faster, for I was beginning to sense that I was not exactly what everybody saw every day. Eyes were upon me longer than they needed to be. By the time I got to the drugstore, I was running. I slipped in and went to the magazine stand. I picked up a comic book and began to read. Footsteps came toward me. Below the bottom pictures, I saw a pair of pants and saddle shoes. One shoe went tap, tap. The feet did a kind of hop step, and I watched them walk to the other side of me. Tap, tap, tap. Again, a hop step, and the shoes and pants circled me. Then came a voice. Well, if it isn't Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was a character, I think in early 1900s. I can't remember exactly. 1940s? I don't know. But he was a character that was like a outdoorsman type of character. I looked into a face about the age of my own, but a little more puppyish, I thought. I had about the same coloring, brown eyes, brown hair, a bigger nose than mine, and more big ears, but a very assured face. I said, well? I grinned because it had been a long time since I had seen a young man my age. The young man didn't answer. He simply took my sleeve between his fingers and examined it closely. Did you chew it yourself? He asked. I looked at the spot he was examining and said, well, no, I pounded it on a rock there, but I did have to chew it a bit around the neck. It stuck me. We looked at each other then. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know where to begin. He picked up my sleeve again. My kid brother has one that looks more real than this thing. What do you got that on for anyway? I looked at his clothes. He had a nicer pair of gray slacks, a white shirt opened at the neck, and a leather jacket. As I looked at these things, I found my voice. Well, I'd rip anything like you have on all to pieces in about a week. He didn't answer. He walked around me again. Where did you say you come from? I didn't say, but I come from a farm up that way. What'd you say your name was? Well, you called me Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone, eh? He walked around me once more and then peered at me. You're from New York. I can tell the accent. He leaned against the cosmetic counter. Come on now, tell me, is this what the kids are wearing in New York now? Is this gang stuff? I am hardly a member of a gang, I said. Are you? Out here? Nah, we bowl. The conversation went to bowling for a while, and then he looked at his watch. I gotta go. You sure are a sight, Boone. What you doing anyway? Playing cowboys and Indians? Come on up to the Gribbly farm, and I'll show you what I'm doing. I'm doing research. But who knows when we're all going to be blown to bits and need to know how to smoke venison. Gee, you New York guys can sure double talk. What does that mean? Burn a block down? No, it means smoke venison, I said. I took a piece out of my pocket and gave it to him. He smelled it and handed it back. Man, what do? Eat it? I sure do, I answered. I don't know whether to send you home to play with my kid brother or call the cops. He shrugged his shoulders and repeated that he had to go. As he left, he called back, The Gribbly farm? Yes, come on up if you can find it. I browsed through the magazines until the clerk got anxious to sell me something, and then I wandered out. Most of the people were in church. I wandered around the town and back to the road. It was nice to see people again. At the outskirts of town, a little boy came bursting out of the house with his shoes off, and his mother came bursting out after him. I caught the little fellow by the arm, and I held him until his mother picked him up and took him back. As she went up the steps, she stopped and looked at me. She stepped toward the door, and I walked back a few steps. And then she looked at me again. I began to feel conspicuous and took the road to my mountain. I passed the little old strawberry lady's house. I almost went in, and then something told me to go home. I found Frightful, untied her, stroked her creamy breast feathers, and spoke to her. Frightful, I made a friend today. Do you think that is what I had in mind all the time? The bird whispered. I was feeling sad as we kicked up the leaves and started home through the forest. On the other hand, I was glad I had met Mr. Jacket, as I called him. I never asked his name. I had liked him, although we hadn't even had a fight. All the best friends I had, I always fought, then got to like them after the wounds healed. That afternoon darkened. The nuthatches that had been clinking around the trees were silent. The chickadees had vanished. A single crow called from the edge of the road. There were no insects singing. There were no catbirds, no orioles. Oh, that's a new bird that we haven't heard of yet. Or vireos, or robins. Ooh, I'm going to look up those two birds so that we can find out what those are. Frightful, I said, it is winter. It is winter, and I have forgotten to do a terribly important thing, stack up a big wood pile. The stupidity of this sent Mr. Jacket right out of my mind, and I bolted down the valley to my mountain. Frightful flapped to keep her balance. As I crossed the stones to my mountain trail, I said to the bird, sometimes I wonder if I will make it till spring. And that is the end of that chapter. So this is going to be the last time we read before spring break. We're on page 112 now, and there are 177 pages in the book, so we've got quite a bit still to read. But I'll make sure that I do a summary before the next reading so that we kind of remember where we left off. And there will be a discussion question for you guys on Schoology for today. And I'm hoping that you watch the first lesson of the ecosystem restoration unit, because I kind of like to talk about that in our discussion question, and maybe talk about some of the ecosystems that you guys learned about in that lesson and how it applies to Sam and his situation. Okay, so I will see you next time.